Imagine a computer so large it fills an entire building. A machine that consumes as much electricity as a small town, generates enough heat to warm every room around it, and breaks down so often that engineers work in shifts around the clock just to keep it running. Now imagine holding that same computing power in the palm of your hand. That is the story of computers. And it happened in less than a single human lifetime. Welcome to Silicon Epochs. I'm glad you're here. Part 1. The Giants of Glass and Wire, 1940s to 1950s. The year is 1945. World War II is ending. And in a basement laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania, something extraordinary is being assembled. Its name is ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. And it is, by most accounts, the world's first general-purpose electronic computer. ENIAC weighs 30 tons. It stretches across 167 square meters of floor space. It contains over 17,000 vacuum tubes, small glass cylinders that glow like light bulbs and control the flow of electricity. Every single one of them can fail. And they do, constantly. But when ENIAC works, it is astonishing. It can perform 5,000 additions per second. Human mathematicians doing the same calculations by hand would need days. ENIAC needs seconds. The machine was originally built to calculate artillery firing tables for the US Army, but it quickly proved useful for everything from weather forecasting to nuclear weapons research. Programming ENIAC was not like programming a computer today. There was no keyboard, no screen, no software. To give ENIAC a new task, engineers had to physically rewire the machine. Dozens of cables, hundreds of switches, all rearranged by hand. Setting up a single calculation could take days. And yet, this was the beginning. In 1951, the first commercial computer arrived. The UNIVAC, short for Universal Automatic Computer, was sold to the United States Census Bureau. It became famous when it predicted Dwight Eisenhower's landslide presidential election victory on live television, before the votes were even fully counted. America was stunned. A machine had just predicted the future. The vacuum tube era had one enormous problem, though. Those 17,000 glass tubes in ENIAC were fragile, hot, and power-hungry. Building more powerful computers meant using more tubes. And more tubes meant more heat, more failures, more electricity, more space. Something had to change. And in 1947, it already had, though nobody fully realized it yet. Part TWO. The Tiny Revolution, 1950s to 1960s. In December 1947, 3 scientists at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain, demonstrated something remarkable. A small device made of germanium that could amplify electrical signals without any moving parts, without any glass, without any heat. They called it the transistor. The transistor did everything a vacuum tube could do, but it was smaller than a fingernail, used a fraction of the power, generated almost no heat, and almost never broke down. At first, the computing world was slow to adopt it. Vacuum tubes worked. Why change? But by the late 1950s, transistors had taken over. Computers shrank from the size of buildings to the size of large refrigerators. They became more reliable. They became more affordable, though affordable still meant millions of dollars. The IBM 7090, released in 1959, was one of the most powerful transistor-based computers of its era. It was used by NASA to track early space missions, including John Glenn's orbit of Earth in 1962. When engineers needed real-time calculations during that flight, the 7090 was there. But transistors were just the beginning of miniaturization. Because in 1958, an engineer named Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments had a new idea. What if you didn't just replace the vacuum tube with a transistor? What if you put the entire circuit, transistors, resistors, and all the connections between them, onto a single piece of semiconductor material? He called it the integrated circuit. And it would change everything. Part 3. Everything on a chip, 1960s to 1970s. The integrated circuit, or microchip, packed what previously required an entire room of components onto a piece of silicon smaller than your thumbnail. In 1965, an Intel engineer named Gordon Moore made an observation that would become one of the most famous predictions in technology history. He noticed that the number of transistors engineers could fit onto a single chip was doubling roughly every 2 years. And he predicted this would continue. He was right. For decades. This observation became known as Moore's Law. and it drove an extraordinary pace of progress. Every 2 years, computers got roughly twice as powerful without getting any larger or more expensive. The 1960s saw computers move into universities, large corporations, and government agencies. IBM's System 360, released in 1964, was a breakthrough because it introduced a family of compatible computers, different models for different budgets, but all running the same software. For the first time, businesses could upgrade their computer without losing all their programs. And then came 1969. The Apollo guidance computer helped put humans on the moon. It had less computing power than a modern digital watch, but it was reliable, compact, and fast enough to guide a spacecraft through 250,000 miles of space and land it gently on the lunar surface. Computing was no longer just about calculation. It was about control, guidance, and intelligence. Part 4. The Computer Comes Home, 1970s to 1980s. In 1971, Intel released a chip that would transform the world. The Intel 4004 was the first commercially available microprocessor. It put the entire central processing unit, the brain of the computer, onto a single chip. It was designed originally for a Japanese calculator company, but its implications went far beyond calculators. If you could put a CPU on one chip, you didn't need a room full of equipment anymore. You didn't even need a large cabinet. You might, someday, need only a box that could sit on a desk. That day came quickly. In 1977, Apple introduced the Apple II. It came in a mold plastic case, included a keyboard, and could be connected to a television. It cost about $1,300. For the first time, ordinary people, not just scientists or corporations, could own a computer. The same year, the Commodore PET and the Tandy TRS-80 arrived. The personal computer revolution had begun. And then in 1981, IBM released the IBM PC. This was the moment everything changed for business. IBM was the most trusted name in computing, and its endorsement of the personal computer concept told every company in America that it was time to take this seriously. IBM made one fateful decision with the PC, though. They used an operating system from a small company called Microsoft, and they allowed Microsoft to license that same software to other manufacturers. Within a few years, dozens of companies were making IBM-compatible computers. The PC market exploded, and Microsoft became one of the most valuable companies in history. Meanwhile, in a garage in Los Altos, California, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were building something different. Something that would, eventually, change everything again. Part 5. The Computer Gets a Face, 1980s to 1990s. In 1984, Apple introduced the Macintosh. The commercial that announced it aired during the Super Bowl. It showed a dystopian world of conformity being shattered by a woman throwing a hammer at a giant screen. It ran once. It is still talked about today. The Macintosh was not the first computer with a graphical user interface. That distinction belongs to the Xerox Alto from 1973, and later the Apple Lisa. But the Macintosh was the first to bring those ideas to a mass market at a price that, while still high, was within reach of consumers. Instead of typing commands, you used a mouse to click on pictures. Folders looked like folders. Files looked like documents. Trash went into a trash can. The computer finally made sense to people who had never thought of themselves as technical. Microsoft responded with Windows. After several rough early versions, Windows 95 became a cultural phenomenon. People lined up at midnight to buy it. The operating system came with a new feature, a start button. And through that start button, millions of people first discovered what the Internet could do. Because while personal computers were evolving, something even more transformative was being built, just not where most people could see it. Part 6. The World Connects, 1990s to 2000s. The Internet had existed in various forms since the late 1960s, as a US military and academic network called ARPANET. But it was not until 1991 that a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee released the World Wide Web, a system of documents connected by links, readable in a browser. In 1993, a browser called Mosaic made the web accessible to ordinary users with images, text, and clickable links on the same page. Within months, millions of people were online. The late 1990s brought an explosion of optimism about what the Internet could do. Companies were formed, billions of dollars were invested, and fortunes were made and lost in months. The dot-com bubble inflated and burst. But beneath the chaos, something permanent was being built. Google launched in 1998, and quietly reorganized all human knowledge. Amazon began selling books and then everything else. Email replaced letters. Then it replaced phone calls. Computing was no longer a tool you sat in front of. It was becoming the environment you lived in. And then, in 2007, one more thing. Part 6. The World Connects, 1990s to 2000s. The Internet had existed in various forms since the late 1960s, as a US military and academic network called ARPANET. But it was not until 1991 that a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee released the World Wide Web, a system of documents connected by links, readable in a browser. In 1993, a browser called Mosaic made the web accessible to ordinary users with images, text, and clickable links on the same page. Within months, millions of people were online. The late 1990s brought an explosion of optimism about what the Internet could do. Companies were formed, billions of dollars were invested, and fortunes were made and lost in months. The dot-com bubble inflated and burst. But beneath the chaos, something permanent was being built. Google launched in 1998 and quietly reorganized all human knowledge. Amazon began selling books and then everything else. Email replaced letters. Then it replaced phone calls. Computing was no longer a tool you sat in front of. It was becoming the environment you lived in. And then, in 2007, one more thing. Part 7. The Computer in Your Pocket, 2000s to 2010s. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and said, "Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything." He was not exaggerating. The iPhone combined a phone, an internet browser, and a music player into a single touchscreen device. It had no physical keyboard. Critics said it would fail. Instead, it launched a new era of computing. Android followed later that year. Within a decade, more than 3 billion people carried a smartphone. Think about what that means. 3 billion people, many of them in countries that had never had reliable access to computers or libraries or banking, suddenly held in their hands a device more powerful than any computer that existed before the year 2000. The smartphone did something else, too. It created a permanent, always-on connection between people and the Internet. And that connection generated an almost incomprehensible amount of data. To store and process that data, a new kind of infrastructure emerged: cloud computing. Instead of running software on your own machine, you connected to vast data centers operated by Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. Your computer became a window. The real work happened somewhere else, on machines you would never see. By 2015, a $1 chip contained more computing power than all the computers that existed in 1965 combined. Moore's law had delivered on its promise. And now, something new was beginning to emerge from all that power. Part 8. The Age of Thinking Machines, 2020s. Artificial intelligence is not a new idea. Scientists have dreamed of thinking machines since the 1950s. Alan Turing, one of the founding fathers of computer science, asked the question, "Can machines think?" as early as 1950. But for decades, AI remained mostly theoretical. The computers of the 20th century were not powerful enough to do what AI required. That changed in the 2010s. Researchers discovered that by feeding neural networks, software systems loosely modeled on the human brain, enormous amounts of data and enormous amounts of computing power, machines could learn to recognize images, understand speech, translate languages, and play complex games better than any human. In 2016, an AI called AlphaGo defeated the world champion at the game of Go, a feat that experts had predicted would take another decade to achieve. In 2022, systems like DALL-E and ChatGPT showed that AI could generate images and write text with startling fluency. Millions of people used them overnight. And today, specialized chips like NVIDIA's H100 and Apple's M-series processors are designed from the ground up to accelerate AI calculations. Computers are no longer just tools that follow instructions. They are systems that can learn, adapt, and, in some narrow but remarkable ways, create. Meanwhile, a different kind of computing is taking its first steps. Quantum computers, which use the principles of quantum physics to process information in fundamentally different ways, are beginning to solve problems that would take classical computers longer than the age of the universe. We are, by almost any measure, at the most extraordinary moment in the history of computing. We started with a 30-ton machine that filled a building and needed an army of engineers to keep it running. We end with devices smaller than a coin that can hold the sum of human knowledge, connect to anyone on Earth, and begin to think. In 80 years. Less than a single human lifetime. The story of computers is, in many ways, the story of our era, of what happens when human curiosity compounds on itself, when each generation stands on the shoulders of the last, and when a good idea, made slightly better, again and again and again, changes the world beyond recognition. This is Silicon Epochs. We are just getting started. In the next episode, we go deeper, back to that basement in Philadelphia, to the engineers who spent 3 years wiring 17,000 glass tubes by hand, and to the extraordinary moment when ENIAC first came to life. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And thank you for watching.